Alles Gute zum neuen Jahr.
Shana Tova.
Feliz Año Nuevo.
Čuvo novoboršo.
Szczęśliwego Nowego Roku.
Gelukkig Nieuwjaar.
Najbardziej szubkamnay. Z Nowym Godem.
新年快樂
Maligong bagong taon.
表现这样的对明了表达这些。
Bon année.
Namisal dinga badanya.
Kali Protocronia.
Buon anno.
新年快乐
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Thank you for supporting all of us at the Queens Public Library. We wish you and your families a great New Year.
Begin 2023 with a library card. Get access to all our materials, including books, ebooks, e-magazines, music, movies, and more. Apply in person at your nearest QPL location or apply for an e-card online at queenslibrary.org. Martin Luther King Jr. Day is on January 16th. To honor this civil rights icon, we have special programs and recommended books and movies. Visit our blog at queenslibrary.org for more information. Join us for a new year of virtual author talks. Our Literary Thursdays series brings you live conversations with amazing writers every Thursday at 6 p.m. Learn more at queenslib.org/Literary Thursdays. Celebrate Lunar New Year, the year of the rabbit, with our programs and book recommendations. You can learn more at queenslib.org/LNY 2023.
Welcome to Wellness Wednesdays. I'm Christopher Galarza, Queens Public Library's Community Health Educator. Today, we welcome back Cherise Francis for a monthly workshop series where we will read and discuss excerpts from essays and generate written work based on prompts inspired by the memoir anthology You Are Your Best Thing, Vulnerability, Shame Resilience, and the Black Experience, edited by Tarana Burke and Brene Brown. Based on the quotation from Toni Morrison's Beloved, how can we see ourselves as our own best thing? How does living in our truth give us the breathing room to be our full selves? We will be deep diving into various themes like vulnerability, family, healing, spirituality, social and institutional oppressions, art, and memory. Cherise, please take it away.
Thank you, Christopher. Happy New Year to everyone. Today we'll be talking about intersectional identities and vulnerability. This is the first thing I would like to share. This is from a local Queens artist named Ife Chijina, and she's currently working on a series about Black malehood and vulnerability. And just in case you can't see, I will read each of the art pieces. The first one at the top left, you can see the signs reading their facial expressions. I don't take it personally when people cross the street. Let people be afraid of my Blackness. And that's from Bradley. The next one at the top right is I'd rather be perceived as a predator than a victim. That's from Mike. And at the bottom is anger in a kind of compass direction form. Anger with no direction is unhealthy. And that's from Jason. So I wanted to share this series from Iffy because I believe it shows Black men being vulnerable and expressing how they feel in a way that doesn't often get expressed in public, in media, especially current social media landscape with the whole manosphere issues that are happening and arising right now. And I want to use this session to talk about how can we think of vulnerability different, especially when we think about intersectionality. And to begin, I wanted to discuss what intersectionality is. So intersectionality was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. Its definition, according to Kimberly, is intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. The term is originally for Black women specifically, and was used as a tool to examine the intersections of racism and sexism and how it affected Black women and how Black women moved through society. Since then, it's been used in various ways, some correctly, some incorrectly, but it's expanded to think about the intersections of identities in general and how it affects how an individual moves and is perceived throughout society. So today we'll be reading excerpts from 3 essays: Marc Lamont Hill's Never Too Much, in which he writes about Black male experience, Kia Brown's We Are Human Too, and she writes about Black disabled experience, and Laverne Cox, Hurt People, and she writes about Black trans experience. And before we get into Marc Lamont Hill's essay first, just wanted to define vulnerability as well. From Oxford Languages, it's the quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. So basically vulnerability, with being vulnerable, it's basically allowing us to accept that we can be harmed as well as we can harm others, and our need for developing emotional intelligence, knowing the possibility that we can be harmed and we can harm others. And there's a term called intersectional harm that doesn't really have a definition, but I gave the definition of recognizing how the different intersections of someone's identity reveals the particular ways in which they are harmed or violated by a social structure or system, or have a harder time navigating that structure or system. So let's get into reading Marc Lamont Hill's Never Too Much. I was about 5 years old when it happened. I don't recall who it was, but somebody in my family said something that hurt my feelings. I don't remember what they said, and I don't know if it was even particularly hurtful, but I do remember crying. I cried a lot when I was a boy. Too much, I was told. I was different, I was told. I was too sensitive, an observation that felt like both a judgment and a reprimand. Too sensitive, these words that carried suspicion and wariness. Too sensitive. These words are among my earliest memories. They have haunted me ever since. As a young child, I was quiet. Like my mother, I was a reader. I didn't want to run around outside as much as my brothers, and I had not yet been bitten by the basketball bug that hit most of my neighborhood. Instead, I wanted to stay in the house or sit on the steps, losing myself in books my mother brought home from work. These were not, I would learn, be suitable choices for a Black boy, particularly one growing up in North Philadelphia. This isn't one of those gently anti-Black stories about anti-intellectualism or homophobia in my community. As Americans, we were as susceptible as anyone else to those elements, but not exceptionally so. We were human, not pathological. Something else was happening. I was loved deeply, but we lived in a world framed by suffocating ideas about who a Black person, who a Black man needed to be in order to be safe and happy. This world held few spaces for little Black boys who moved through the world in ways I was naturally inclined to move. So I learned to move differently. I learned not to cry. I learned that my humanity was bound up in my masculinity. I was taught that my masculinity was best shown through physical strength and paying bills and controlling space and being emotionally lean. And although we don't want to admit it, there was a functionality to this type of masculinity. As unhealthy as our performances were, looking tough and acting hard meant that these people would be less likely to test us. Looking like we could fight meant that we wouldn't have to fight. And most of the time deep down we didn't want to fight. We just wanted to live. We just wanted to be loved well. We wanted to be seen. We wanted to be respected. We wanted to be human. My model for manhood came from my father. He held our family close and led us through storms, including the ones created by his own unhealthy masculinity. Although he was an educated man, he loved to work with his hands. He spent most of his free time fixing the broken down rental properties he owned. The repairs, the painting, the roofing, he did it all himself. I would run behind him on the way to whatever property he was fixing. He would call out from the front of the car, put that book down, look at the building they're putting up over there. Part of that was, I'm sure, teaching me to be more social and observant. The other part, I think, was about balancing me out, pulling me away from the boy who sat on stoops and read Judy Blume while other children ran around. Like most men of his generation, my father showed little emotion and no vulnerability. And what other examples were there? Pop culture gave us The Cosby Show, but the Huxtable world of expensive art and famous friends was too foreign to seem real. And the other shows, Different Strokes, What's Happening, didn't have present Black fathers. Good Times gave us James Evans Sr. until he died in a car accident in Mississippi. But when he was present, James was the personification of traditional masculinity. He loved and provided for his family. He showed no vulnerability, no tears. James' emotional expression lived in two spheres: sensual desire for his wife and anger at some disruption or injustice. Lust and rage have always been hallmarks of American manhood, and they're supported by the assertion they are representative too of a certain kind of logic. They make sense. They're reasonable. They're certainly not womanish, which is limited to crying or hysteria. Hysteria comes from the Greek meaning womb, where life is formed. We have decried and diminished women for how they express their feelings, how they expose their vulnerability. At the same time, we yell and scream and punch walls, all while complaining that women are too emotional. We fail to see that our expressions of masculine rage are in fact emotions. And in our rage, we are never told that we are too sensitive or too emotional. As long as our legible emotion is anger, we are never shamed. These are the rules I learned and spent most of my early life following religiously. And I will stop there for now, just so we have time. Yes. So in Mark Lamont Hill's essay, he talks about basically how patriarchy and these narrow ideas of how we view masculinity harms Black men and Black boys. And I wanted to share this term from Dr. Boyd Franklin called invisibility syndrome. And invisibility syndrome is a paradoxical process in which African American men, because of their high visibility, are perceived with fear and distrust and are often ignored or avoided by white society. This fear, avoidance, and anger, often directed at African American men as a result of racism, can have devastating impact on their self-esteem. So basically with invisibility syndrome is because of the hyper visibility of being a Black man in society, where in media, in public discourse, we're often taught that Black men are scary, or we should be afraid to be around them, or they're seen as thugs, or mostly negative stereotypes. It limits the scope of not just how we see Black men, but also how Black men see themselves. And as Mark Lamont Hill discussed in his essay, the only portrayals of Black men that were shown to him were ones that fit that kind of hyper masculine stereotype, and which is usually emotions of lustfulness, showing sensual or sexual desire, or being angry, and the anger fitting into that stereotype of Blackness being angry or being the angry brute. And so it limits how much Black men can express themselves and express their vulnerability as well. And I want to mention this quote from In Search of Manhood, The Black Male Struggle for Identity and Power by Dr. Aza Nidhari. Within the cultural framework of America, the systematic structure is characterized by white male patriarchy that allows for Black males to have the ability to negotiate the way in which they have been socialized and institutionalized to think, act, and behave because they are men. However, the reality of race and the lack of diversity in the purest sense impedes upon this effort and cripples the Black male's ability to truly transition into manhood. He is left to constantly struggle and fight for an identity, for power, for respect, and for understanding of who he is versus what he's projected as an N-word. The reactionary behaviors and coping mechanisms that manifest from this cultural group may appear incomprehensible to one who is not challenged with an anomalous form of self-awareness defined by a conflicting identity that forces the Black male to view himself through the lens of the dominant culture that does not perceive and does not allow him to function as an equal. So basically in that quote, Aza is talking about how a lot of the kind of hyper masculine posturing that we sometimes see from Black men and Black boys is often a cover up for their feelings of insecurity in dealing in a society that is racist and doesn't treat them as equal and doesn't really understand them. And I wanted to bring in Bell Hooks as well. Bell Hooks has done a couple of books that talks about Black men and Black masculinity. And in We Real Cool, Hooks, this is from Thank You to Bell Hooks from Black Men by Ayanna Robertson. She mentions Hooks examines how racism helped to form societal expectations for Black men. Within neo-colonial white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, the Black male body continued to be perceived as an embodiment of bestial, violent, penis as weapon, hypermasculine assertion. She lamented that as Black people in a white supremacist society, we were taught to shun vulnerability as means to survive, namely because that keeps us from love. And so because of the way society portrays Black men and is conditioned to see Black men, it often puts Black men in a box of not being able to develop their emotional intelligence, not being able to express a full range of their emotions, a full range of their sensuality. And as I mentioned before, their hyper masculine posturing, which is what I mentioned in previous workshops about its relation to masking and how you portray yourself in a certain way to hide how you really are on the inside. And as Mark Lamont Hill mentions in his essay, he did the same thing to hiding his love for books, hiding his sensitive side, just so he could survive and navigate through a society that wouldn't allow him to be who he was because they saw that as weak and saw that as being vulnerable. So those feelings of vulnerability or helplessness and even trauma cannot be shown and cannot be expressed, cannot be worked through because the society does not support the person being vulnerable. And how not being vulnerable and not showing the ways that you may not fulfill this idea of strength can have a negative effect on your well-being and your mental health and even your physical health as well. So, in thinking about vulnerability as and weakness, or how our society is conditioned to see weakness or any displays of weakness as not a form of power, I wanted to talk about disability politics. So, this is an essay, We Are Human Too, on Blackness, Vulnerability, Disability, and the Work Ahead from Kia Brown. And we'll read a little bit from there. In the spirit of honesty, I'm still figuring out what it means to be me. I know that I'm a Black, disabled, queer woman, and with that comes the kind of beauty, pain, joy, and exhaustion to which words can't really do justice. But I try anyway because writing is one of the central ways I express myself, and self-expression is imperative to my survival. I am who I am: journalist, author, screenwriter, pop culture and fashion obsessive, cheesecake loving, home goods swooning, romantic comedy aficionado, and I often find that writing about the things that make me me is how I make sense of the world and the people in it. I also write to make sense of, reckon with, explore, and decide who I want to be in that world. I'm a Black woman with cerebral palsy. It affects the right side of my body. I walk with a limp and have delayed motor skills as well as limited range of motion. I've not always been proud of my disability. For the majority of my life, as I'd navigate public space, I'd curl in on myself with every passing stranger stare at my hand or leg. I never wanted to be the center of their attention, and the gawking always felt like being told that I was what they considered other. It also felt impossible for the gawkers to exist without making me feel bad as revenge for disrupting their lives with my existence. I became ashamed of my appearance, of my limp leg and hand too. But I've always loved being Black. In fact, the very first thing I ever learned to love about myself was my Black skin. As a kid, I watched Brandy as Cinderella, her beautiful blue gown in the center of attention, the prince unable to help falling in love with her, and my mother as she would put on her makeup. And I was in awe of the way we shared this beautiful skin, enamored with the idea that both a fictional woman and a real one could make me feel worthy simply by having this one thing in common. There was a time when loving and sharing my Black skin with these beautiful Black women was enough to keep me going, but at 12, that stopped being so. As I turned my ear towards what my peers and society thought of disability, my own self-hatred began. A classmate made fun of me in the cafeteria, mocking the fact that I walked with a limp. For 12-year-old me, the discovery of my disability as a bad thing was earth-shattering, fueling a self-hatred with the shame of being different, undesirable, and invisible. Long gone would be the ways when my Blackness alone nurtured my worth. The most interesting thing about shame is that it hangs around like all bad habits do, thriving on its familiarity, allowed to remain because we are either too tired or too jaded to think we can survive without it. I carry the shame that popped up in the cafeteria with me to high school, throughout college, and well into adulthood. Along the way, I picked up the shame of being bad at numbers, of hating the way my voice sounded, of needing help, and of what society told me was physically unattractive. I wish that God would spare me and I'd wake up the next day in a better body. From the ages of 12 to 25, shame stole my ability to truly dream. I cared only about surviving and let shame convince me that no one genuinely cared about me. What I did not know is that shame would still be there after I learned to love myself and my body. For shame switches tactics. After overcoming the initial shame of my existence, I didn't really want to talk about how I felt ashamed of my body and of being me. When I wrote my book in 2019 about my journey to self-love, I wanted to project that I've always possessed this self-assurance and self-acceptance, but I had to tell the truth. And afterward, as you might guess, I felt more shame for the person I'd once been. I'd gone from hating myself all those years to embarrassment and regret of having ever felt that way in the first place, of having ever wanted a better, more digestible body. Thankfully, God intervened. And as my profile began to rise and I had to talk more about what it took to get to the side of self-love, I had to learn to forgive myself. I gotten pretty far in life with the girl I once was, so I couldn't begrudge and shame her now. I can only hope she sees the woman we are today and rejoices. And I wanted to go to this next part before we end this excerpt. Like most of the world in 2020, I cried tears of fear and worry or of loneliness for missing my friends and loved ones, wanting them to be as safe and healthy as possible. I've always operated under the idea that to cry and be emotional as a Black woman is an act of resistance. I don't subscribe to the idea that I can't be emotional simply because our society has no idea what to do with the genuine feelings and humanness of women. I will feel, be, and do as much as I want proudly for the rest of my life. To be vulnerable and emotional as a Black woman is to live in power, which I take back every day, not apologizing for who I am or the space I take up as I move throughout the world. We'll end there. So, in thinking about intersectional identities and vulnerability, I wanted to relate how vulnerability and disability kind of relates also to how we think about Black malehood as well. Despite them being different intersectional identities, the topic of disability plays into the idea of this fear of being seen as weak or being vulnerable. And people who are Black and disabled, they're marginalized identities within an already marginalized community. And so going back to the invisibility syndrome that we mentioned earlier with Black men, that can also play into disability as well, that when everyone is hyper focused on a person's disability, it also kind of erases their humanity and the full scope of who they are as a person. And disabled Black people are often affected by these stereotypes of how we see Black people in general, such as Kia mentioning the kind of like strong Black woman trope, where Black women are not allowed to be seen as emotional and vulnerable and in need of protection as well. And the overall view of Black people being resilient to pain or not feeling as much pain as other groups of people, which is not true. And so there's also health and economic disparities that, because Black disabled people are both Black and disabled, those disparities are compounded for them as well. So in listening to Black and disabled people, we can rethink how we view Blackness, how we view resilience, how we view disability, and how we view vulnerability. And one Black disabled advocate that I wanted to share is Imani Barbarin, who goes by Crutches and Spice, I believe, on Instagram. And she talks about how, in this quote here, she talks about how there's a lot of Black disabled peers and ancestors like Harriet Tubman, Fannie Lou Hamer, Henrietta Lacks, Audre Lorde, who their disability was part of their existence, and their disability helped them be the leaders they were in society. And I just want to read some of what she said. These pioneers recognized the impact that disability had on their lives and spoke their truths to the world, not in spite of their disabilities, but because of them. They sparked the modern-day disability justice movement, advocating for the inclusion of marginalized voices within the disability community. They are the ones who taught us to be audacious in our hope and fervent in our love for ourselves and one another. Clinging to this revolutionary legacy has helped me survive the pandemic this far. And that was from the Black Love series in Cosmopolitan. And I wanted to continue with Imani Barbarin on Blackness and disability. This was from On Being Black and Disabled, but Not Really. So in this article, Barbarin talks about her cousin and her cousin basically hiding the fact that they needed to see the doctor because they weren't feeling well. They had a medical emergency, but her cousin being scared to do so because, as we've discussed in other workshops, that the medical institutions have often a bias against Black people in hospitals and other medical spaces as well. And that conversation with her cousin reminded her of an exchange that she had. That exchange with her cousin reminded her of an episode from Netflix's Queer Eye called Disabled But Not Really, in which a 30-year-old Black man in a wheelchair was one of the Fab Five's clients. And he became a topic of much contention in the disability community because he basically said that he was disabled, but not really, because he was trying to downplay his disability because he probably already knew that he was seen as both a Black man, but also disabled. And that made him doubly vulnerable in society. And so people in the disabled community were basically feeling that he was spreading internalized ableism and perpetuating a culture of shame around the disabled identity. But Black people have a long Imani was saying Black people have a long history of hiding ailments for fear of dire consequences. And she says, often disability is kept as a side note to a Black person's identity for fear that references to any impairment might be taken as weakness. Harriet Tubman suffered a traumatic brain injury at the hands of a slave overseer. Fannie Lou Hamer had polio as a child. Maya Angelou had selective mutism. Yet when we talk about our heroes as Black people, we rarely, if ever, mention the disabilities they lived with. Many current Black celebrities and leaders with disabilities feel they can only become successful by ignoring or showing they can overcome their diagnoses. It is still a shock to some that Stevie Wonder reads Braille. And she continues discussing about how ableism is in the Black community, is often feared because since Blackness is already a marginalized identity, to be also disabled and Black is an extra burden as well. And she says Black disabled people, for example, experience a unique form of racist micro and macroaggressions that sway into the realm of ableism. People who need supports like Medicare, Medicaid, or food stamps are welfare queens. Disabled Black people hear speculation as to whether they're crack babies, a misleading and deeply problematic concept. Black people in search of medical care are just looking for drugs. Even run-of-the-mill racism is steeped in ableist language. Black people cannot think or vote for themselves, or Black people don't have the intelligence to have built pyramids, has to have been aliens. So she discusses how ableist language is often used to put down Black people already. So to be also disabled and Black is not viewed as being in need of support. And she says what Hamilton seems to understand is that in order to reach the disabled people in the community that he wants to serve, and this is Hamilton from the Queer Eye show, he must wheel a very fine line. He needs to talk about disability in such a way that Black people don't feel further disenfranchised by recognizing it within themselves. Because of factors like environmental, structural, and implicit racism, as well as violent acts and poverty, Black people are one of the most likely demographics to develop disabilities. Just getting them to a supportive space can be a hurdle. As a proud disabled Black advocate, I come across many people who try to erase my disability and think that by talking about it, I am alienating the very people I need. This hurts most when it comes from my own community, Black people. From them, I am told I'm already Black. Why give them another reason to shut the door in your face? Black people are raised to acknowledge that every system they encounter is stacked against them. you have to try twice as hard to get half as far. They are all waiting for you to fail. And you don't get second chances are shared by parents and community elders along with bedtime stories and warm milk. Any sense of vulnerability feels like a weapon that can be turned against oneself rather than a source of strength or power. And in another article, Barbara Ann talks about racism and disability in the Black community. We have to remember that a lot of our history is oppression on the basis of race through disability, Barbara Ann said. During our enslavement, slaves who were disabled were often killed off, starved to death, or sold to freak shows, carnivals, things like that. So our history is tied greatly to our ability to survive. Barbara Ann said this connection between disability and oppression highlights how ableism has historically been used as a tool of white supremacy to make race more tangible. Ableism has been the avenue through which we have eradicated people, she said. Ableism has meant race science, which is the science of diagnosing otherness via race as a disability, trying to find physical characteristics or physical impairment that explains Blackness. All of these different things are disabling in order to perpetuate white supremacy. And that was from the Eagle disability rights activist Imani Barbara Ann on the systematic obstacles facing the disabled community. So in Imani Barbara Ann's work, you can see that she talks about how the entire system that we live in is structured in a way to make Blackness already a disability. And so to be socially disabled and also physically disabled and mentally disabled is seen as a double marginalization. And so the intersections of those two identities can cause intersectional harm to that individual, where if they're already dealing with their own well-being and trying to be healthy because they're disabled, it's already they live in a system and a structure that will make that disability even harder to live with because they lack the supports to thrive with that disability. So in thinking again about intersectional identities and vulnerability, I want to talk about the trans community with Laverne Cox and Hurt People, Hurt People. I don't know how to leave my front door and not armor up. I'm becoming aware of just how automatic it is for me, and it makes me really sad because I would love to let it go. I had surgery earlier this year, and about 2 weeks afterward, I had to go to the pharmacy and pick up a prescription. This is in Hollywood. It was my first time leaving the house after surgery, and I couldn't walk fast. I felt vulnerable. It was scary because my way is to walk fast and to always look around me, hyper aware of my environment. Because I've been kicked on the street, I've been harassed, all kinds of shit has gone down. And that day I was coming back from the pharmacy wearing my mask and a visor, and this woman says, "Hey sister, how you doing?" "Oh, excuse me, I mean brother," and totally misgenders me. Still today, this happened this year. I often associate the misgendering with danger because I don't know what's about to happen. And I was thinking, I can't run now, I can't. I was so terribly scared. I'm 48, I'm famous Laverne Cox, and I'm still scared to leave the house. I'm scared of walking down the street because it's still not safe to be a Black trans woman just walking down the street. So the armor is real. My great-grandfather was a freedman in Alabama. One day he was walking around Selma and saw this dead cow on the road. This would have been the early 1900s, I think. He took the dead cow home, cooked it to feed his family, and everybody got sick. but apparently that dead cow belonged to some white people. The white people tracked down my great-grandfather and put him in jail for taking a dead cow off the road. And then once he was put in jail, that was a way to sell Black people back into slavery. They called it sharecropping, but it was forced labor. And so then he was sold out of jail and into indentured servitude. My grandfather, J.P. Cox, was born on the plantation, where he was essentially kept a slave years after emancipation. He and my great uncle Reuben didn't like to talk about it, but they were beaten to make them work. It was deeply traumatizing stuff. My grandfather was a son of a bee. He beat on my grandmother, he cheated on her, he was abusive to the kids. Some of my mother's brothers and sisters have a different memory of that, but my mother tells harrowing stories of domestic violence that my grandfather perpetuated. He had his affairs and never brought money home. The lights would be turned off. All kinds of really effed up, traumatic shit that my grandmother endured, that my mother endured. The compassionate part of me thinks, where were the tools for my grandfather to process having been beaten on a plantation? He passed his trauma along to his kids, and they were traumatized. And my mother, bless her heart, we've worked through a lot of this. She's 70 years old, but my mother was emotionally abusive. She just was. What else did she know? How do we reckon with the story, as Brene says, not just of collective trauma, but of historic trauma? How it is not just passed down in our practice, but passed down in our genes. And I want to move to the last page of the essay. I think many of us are in so much pain, so much hurt. What I've been trying to show is that pain, that hurt is intergenerational, it's historical, and it's collective, and hurt people hurt people. There's a lot of shame, shaming people for their skin color, for their size, for the way they talk. Classism, colorism, misogyny, it's all intersecting. And so it piles up. The work must be to understand that these things are structural, and then we must begin to do the work to stop internalizing all of it. I didn't just solve my internalized transphobia 5 years ago and now I'm good. It's something I still have to work through. It's something I work on every single day. My internalized racism and classism are issues I've had to confront in various ways at times. It's never comfortable. These things are so linked to trauma pathways and neural pathways in my body. These things are so deeply ingrained. Creating new, more resilient pathways, new ways of thinking and acting takes consistent practice. I don't believe we can have conversations about racial justice or gender justice or class justice if we don't talk about shame and trauma. I don't think it's possible. It's actually necessary. So in Laverne Cox's essay, she points out how a lot of these different systems of oppression that we live under are all intersecting. As a Black person, as also a trans person, she has to live at the intersections of both of those identities. But even at both of those identities, the oppressions that she lives under relates to the other intersections of various other kinds of identities. In the essay, she talks about her great-grandfather having to live through slavery and how slavery and racism impacted her family and caused trauma to her family. And that kind of trauma, as she discusses the Black men in her family, they ended up taking that trauma out on their families. And so how these systems that we live under make it harder for us to be healthy, thriving people. And I wanted to share these statistics from the New York Civil Liberties Union and the Human Rights Watch as well, that talks about the different kind of socioeconomic burdens, including experiences of poverty that LGBTQ, and this is a new term that I just found out, transgender, non-conforming, non-binary intersect communities as well. how they often live in experiences of poverty and face food, shelter, and employment insecurity, race-based and gender discrimination, and immigration status issues. They are also notoriously over-policed and over-criminalized, and thus disproportionately likely to end up incarcerated. So just looking at that, you see how the different institutional systems affect different identities as well, especially marginalized gender and sexual identities. And here from Human Rights Watch, transgender people are at a significant risk of violence and harassment in the United States. The 65-page report, I Just Try to Make It Home Safe, Violence and the Human Rights of Transgender People in the United States, documents how persistent marginalization puts transgender people, particularly Black transgender women, at heightened risk of violence at the hands of strangers, partners, family members, and law enforcement. When transgender people did experience violence, whether it is public or private, many felt they did not have access to services designated to protect people from harm. Discrimination by homeless shelter staff and residents, domestic violence service providers, and law enforcement personnel left some without alternative options or basic resources to keep themselves safe. So just from that quote, you could see how that LGBTQ community, trans people are often at the receive intersectional harm from dealing not just with personal violence, but also institutional violence as well. And how that compounded harm from personal and institutions leads them to have a lack of safety, a lack of well-being, a lack of safe spaces to really turn to when they have been harmed. So in thinking about these three intersectional identities, I wanted to share 3 prompts for you to think about and to take away. And this is some more details and statistics about the different harms that trans people face as well. You can read that on your own. So this first prompt is, what are your intersectional identities? And that could include race, sex, gender, class, disability, immigration identity, etc. And how has those different intersections of privilege and or marginalization affected your wellness and health? And that could be either for good or for bad. And what does that reveal about structural and institutional systems around you? And the picture you see here is of Kimberly Crenshaw, who came up with the term intersectionality. The next prompt is, how can you put intersectionality into practice? So write a list of observations and actions about how intersectionality plays out in your everyday life and in your interactions with others. What are some blind spots of privilege that you have not realized before? What specific actions can you take to lessen the harm you may have done to others? And here is a picture of different types of identities that could be intersecting in society. And the last one is, in what ways have you felt vulnerable? So write at least one experience in which you felt vulnerable. How did it make you feel? How did you cope with it? Knowing what you know now, how would you find a better way to cope with it? Or what help would you have needed to cope with it? And I wanted to include this chart from Youth Power's chart about marginalized and vulnerable populations. And it includes intrinsic factors, so personal identity. Then the bigger circle is contextual factors, so interpersonal relationships that you have, such as family, peer groups, and then structural factors, institutional, social, political, economic, environmental policies that affect how you navigate through society, things like that. So those are 3 prompts that you can take away and work on your own. And to end, I would like to share some resources. So I mentioned earlier Bell Hooks' book, Real Cool, Black Men and Masculinity by Bell Hooks. There's a YouTuber named FD Signifier, and it's a great channel to learn about the intersections of Black malehood and the particular nuances of how Black men move throughout society and how patriarchy affects them. And he's a reliable source in looking at those particular nuances of identity. And these 2 conversations with Kize Lemon, last year we read one of his essays from the book, and he also discusses masculinity and vulnerability in his book Heavy. And these are some wonderful conversations that he did with For Harriet, called Masculinity, Body Dysmorphia, Abuse, and Addiction, and Julesy and the SBG Book Club. And he talks more about the different vulnerabilities that Black men feel in society. I also wanted to mention Arrows. Arrows is a trans-masc, non-binary person, and I wanted to mention Arrows because oftentimes when we talk about transness, we talk about trans women, and trans men and trans-masc people are often invisible in these discussions. And so Arrows talks a lot about his personal experiences as well as providing support to the overall LGBTQ community with his documentaries and other videos as well. And of course, I mentioned Imani Barbarin, who does Crutches and Spice on Instagram. And last, I want to mention Personal is Political, The Necessity of Spaces for Black Vulnerability by Atonia Randolph is a great essay to read about the need for creating spaces to allow Black people to actually be vulnerable and be supported in our vulnerability. So thank you, and I will end with that. And if you have any questions, please share in the chat.
Thank you, Cherise. This was this particular workshop really hit home for me. In undergrad, I was a women's and gender studies major, so we spoke a lot about intersectionality, and I wanted to speak more about intersectionality and speak about how right now, at least in public health, I'm sure in other fields too, we're talking more about switching the narrative from equality to equity, right? And to be able to do that, so just to explain a little, equality means that everyone gets the same results, right? So we do some sort of program and everyone is able to leave the program with 5% more ability to do something, right? Which in theory sounds great. But when we look at it, we know that, for instance, the pay gap, right? We often say, well, women make 83% of what men make. But that really doesn't speak about how our intersectional identities will change that number. 82 white women make 82%, Black women make 65%, Hispanic women make 58%. So if we do something to increase equality lens, right, we really aren't achieving parity because there's all these other identities that affect us because of systemic oppression and things like that. So I want you to can you talk a little bit more about equity and what that means in the space of wellness and health to you,
Yeah, so equity, it goes back to, and I want to mention again, Imani Barbarin and disability, right? That as a culture, we like to act like everyone's on the same playing ground when some people are coming into that space with a lot of baggage that they're already carrying, with different abilities that they're able to do either because socially, physically, emotionally, mentally, whatever, that they're carrying, the different intersections of who they are, they're bringing that into the space. So you can't just automatically think that everyone's on the same equal playing field. And so um, in thinking about equity, you have to think about beyond just the kind of flat idea of representation. It's not enough just to have the faces of people in the room. You have to think about the structure of the institutions and spaces that you're creating to make sure that the people who are coming into that space can actually thrive in that space. Because if you don't think about those things, then you're going to sit there and wonder, why is this person leaving, or why can't this person do well in this space? And you're going to blame them and shame them instead of understanding that they may be having a hard time doing well in that space, and that you have to recreate that space to allow them to exist in that space.
Right, and one thing that we have been coming back to again and again, is like allostatic load, right? So different people have different levels of stress, and then that level of stress is going to be affecting the health, is going to be affecting their ability to do their job, their ability to be able to advocate for themselves, right? And we have to really take that into consideration. Um, so Nuri is asking, is intersectionality the same or similar to the social imagination of the School of Sociological Concept? I'm not sure about social imagination, but intersectionality, do you want to explain a little bit, Charisse?
I'm not sure what the social imagination of the School of Sociological Concept is. I will look it up.
Mhm.
But intersectionality was created by Kimberly Crenshaw, and basically it's talking about the different intersections of power and intersections of identity that collide and intersect, that influence how individuals move through society and how they're perceived in society, basically.
Sure. So I just looked up sociological imagination, and it's basically understanding someone's own reality is
Mm,
based in the personal experiences, and then it's within a social and historical context. So,
mm,
so yeah, I think that's a part
yeah.
of it
Yeah.
for sure. And I think adding that history in context, which was so beautifully done in um, in the works that you read today about, I thinking about. Laverne Cox and how she spoke about her family and the
Mm,
experiences of her family and how that affects her
mhm.
today, even though that happened, 3 generations ago.
Right.
Um, and that's again that goes to the idea of this generational trauma, right? And generational trauma and how that affects our health and wellness, and how some people have generations that they have to generational trauma that they have to work through before they can even start working on our present day trauma and our
Mm,
present day wealth and health building.
mm,
Um, no, yeah. So that's so. There's just so many things. This is such like a very deeply um, important topic. Um, I guess we only have 2 minutes left. Is there anything that you really want to talk about? There's one thing I also wanted to comment about patriarchy or systemic oppression. The system has a lot of different names to
mm,
it, and the idea of creating a narrative and about a certain identity, and then within that, it limits the opportunity within that narrative, which
mm,
then limits an individual's opportunity to change that narrative, right? And I
mm.
think Mark Lamont Hill in his essay wrote a little bit about that. So can you just comment about that really quick, and then we'll go.
Yeah, so, and this all goes to us needing to move beyond this kind of individualized
Mhm.
thinking about society and culture, that we often think we shame a person or blame a person for trying to exist in a society that was built for them to fail, basically. And so us needing to think about things on a larger systematic social structure way to help people feel that it's okay for them to be who they are, or that what they've gone through isn't necessarily their fault, and figuring out tools for them to manage to be their full selves as much as they can be within the system that we still have to live in every day. Because blaming yourself, shaming yourself for just trying to survive within the system we live in is just going to cause more harm to you anyway. So learning how to just live and care for yourself, even in the midst of all of it, is the best thing you can do.
Right. And with that, we want to say thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're so glad that you guys loved today. And we will see you next time on Wellness Wednesdays. And have a great day, everyone.
Yes, thank you.